And to help us understand everything that is happening right now around the events at the front and the so-called peace negotiations, Oleksandr Musiienko is joining us, a serviceman of the Territorial Defense Forces of the Armed Forces of Ukraine and a military expert. Welcome.
Welcome, Mr. Oleksandr. Hello.
To you. Well,
it has already become traditional for the information space that negotiations in Moscow between the American delegation and the Russian side ended deep into the night. The Russian delegation was headed by Putin. These negotiations lasted 5 hours, but so far, those 5 hours have only turned into 5 words. The statement from Putin's representative Ushakov that no compromise has been found yet. Should we have expected anything different, and how should we interpret this statement, and what steps should we expect next? Because quite literally we are placing a huge bet on this format of the peace agreement, which was proposed by the US, revised by Europe and by us. So what should we have expected from these negotiations, and what comes next?
I think our main bet should be on the armed forces, on supporting the defense and security forces. I think we've all been convinced of this more than once already. As for the negotiations, I can share my own personal subjective opinion. I did not expect rapid progress, and here's why. Because we understand that this war is quite complex. It's not just about some economic issues. It's not simply about unresolved territorial disputes, as is often the case or has been in other international conflicts. This war, it's fundamentally about the very existence of the Ukrainian state and about whether the Russian Empire will exist or not, and who will directly influence events in Europe, who will determine future dominance, particularly on the European continent. Therefore, considering all these issues together and looking at international practice in conflict resolution and major wars in general, unfortunately, we cannot expect that everything will end very quickly. And let's say after 1, 2, or even 3 rounds of consultations, significant progress should not be expected here, unfortunately. At the same time, what is worth noting? It is worth noting that, basically, according to Stoic philosophical principles, Ukraine is doing everything possible on our part in this situation. So what is being done? Everything is being done so that Ukraine's defense forces are working to ensure that our diplomats and politicians have something to bring to the negotiating table, so that they have something to present at the negotiation platforms. In other words, by maintaining certain positions that allow us to talk and to change specific points, plans either to shorten them or to remove them altogether, as we can see that the initial draft, for example, the plan originally had 28 points, but now, as the president of Ukraine notes, 20. That is, we continue to fight for our interests, including by expanding, for example, the pressure on Russia through deep strikes, attacks deep into Russian territory, expanding the range of targets being hit, and disrupting, among other things, the normal transportation of oil products for Russia, which is very important to them. So, in other words, we are doing a lot of work. And then, of course, it becomes a matter of further consultations, further work, which must be backed by strength. Let's see now what the reaction of the United States and President Donald Trump will be. Just now, a fresh interview came out with U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who, judging by the content, makes the following statement. In the interview he gave, he stands by the position that Ukraine must be sovereign and must have security guarantees. And in 10 years, with the right economic and financial policies, Ukraine's GDP could even surpass Russia's GDP. I think that if the US or the West had finally resigned themselves to the idea that, well, that's it, they need to put pressure exclusively on Ukraine and force it to make peace, because to make Ukraine make the maximum concessions to Russia, this is not the case right now. So obviously the negotiation process will continue, but it will be difficult. It won't be easy. I assume that Putin intends to take advantage of the winter period and to drag things out as much as possible, pretending to be interested in negotiations and consultations. Then why does he need time? Putin is counting on the situation changing by spring. Through actions on the front, they are really hoping to occupy more territory, at least to capture the Donetsk region. This is the Russian plan for next spring, either by mid-spring or the beginning of summer. And then, as they believe in the Kremlin, they think that Ukraine may be more weakened, including as a result of Russian terrorist attacks on our energy sector, on our civilian infrastructure. and then they will be able to come forward with the terms that the Kremlin will impose, which, as they believe, Ukraine will have to accept. Therefore, it is obvious that Putin will drag this out over the winter period, relying precisely on those instruments of war that I mentioned.
You mentioned the interview with U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio. It actually came out just a few seconds before we went live with you, before our conversation started. And here is one of Marco Rubio's quotes, which is now spreading rapidly through our media. And you'll understand why it's spreading once I quote it. Right now, Ukraine and Russia are literally fighting over a territory of about 30 to 50 kilometers, 20% of Donetsk region, which is under the control of Kiev. He noted this, hinting that Ukraine could in fact give up these territories, and in this way, Russia might agree to accept this peace plan. Where is the logic in these words? And we have repeatedly said that for the residents of Kramatorsk, Sloviansk to say that they now have to suddenly find themselves on the territory of the Russian Federation, just like that, after the signing of this plan. Well, in fact, so do you think this isn't actually coercion to peace through such territorial pressure and force?
Or is this more of a trap that the Russians are setting for the Americans, trying to reduce everything to just a few kilometers of Donetsk region?
Of course, it's also a trap because Russia, Putin, is proceeding from the assumption that, well, they'll put pressure on Ukraine regarding everything that concerns it. Here, 20 to 30%, that's how they see it, cynically and cruelly. But we understand that these are people's lives. First of all, just last week, I had a rather emotional and very important conversation with the captain of the Territorial Defense Forces of the Armed Forces, who is originally from Kramatorsk and has been fighting almost without pause. She says that this is our land, our people are there, and we must fight. When you hear this, it's clear that talking about withdrawing now, just leaving the region, would simply create conditions for Russia to advance further. Plus, do you understand what the situation is? Why is Russia insisting on this so much? Because they also understand that they need significant forces, they need a long time, they need effort in order to fight for these settlements. But to simply push and say, just withdraw from there and that's it, means there would be no need to fight any battles at all. But the position remains as it is. The defense forces remain in their positions where the enemy, of course, dominates, where they prevail, and where there are minor advances. Of course, the armed forces withdraw to other defensive positions, but no one gives up this territory without a fight. And this obviously is what Putin would like as well. He would want for the defense forces to simply withdraw. In this way, he would solve at least 2 or even 3 problems for himself. First, he would solve the issue of not needing to make additional efforts to fight for Kramatorsk-Sloviansk. Second, he would achieve the goal of provoking certain moods of demoralization and internal upheaval in Ukraine. And third, he would start to push peace initiatives, plans aimed at limiting and lifting sanctions, and preventing the allocation of Russian frozen assets in favor of Ukraine. Therefore, his logic and the logic of the Kremlin are clear here. But I would like to say, returning again to the statement of the US Secretary of State, he is not saying that Ukraine should withdraw now. The point is that the struggle continues. And yes, I understand that some people looking at this conflict, at this war from a distance, think that it's just about kilometers, territories that can simply be given up right now. And in principle, that would end the war. But the question is, what happens next? And will the war really end? These are the real questions, and as long as they remain unresolved, there will be no progress.
At the same time as these peace negotiations, in the search for compromises around the points of the plan, there are direct statements from Putin about further escalation. His first statement concerned the fact that he publicly gave the order to create a security zone on Russia's northern border. We began to interpret this as a possible increase in pressure and attacks on the Sumy, Kharkiv, and Chernihiv regions. On the other hand, Putin is openly threatening to cut Ukraine off from the sea by striking Ukrainian ports and the ships that enter them. Why have these statements emerged? Then how does this correlate with the fact that Putin constantly tells the Americans that he supports the search for peace? Why are there such escalatory statements?
First of all, I would like to say that it is not worth expecting that Russia, even while engaged in a peace process, would cease fire or reduce escalation. I can remind you that as soon as, back in the spring of this year, the US and Ukraine launched a joint initiative, To make a ceasefire the foundation of everything and only then address the remaining issues, in fact, Russia temporarily agreed to halt its strikes. On the issue of energy, then they broke their own promises that they had made. And on the contrary, this is absolutely in line with the Kremlin's logic to escalate under the guise of any negotiation initiatives. In this way, they believe they are securing leverage for themselves at the negotiating table. So here the actions of the Kremlin are entirely predictable. As for the statements, well, they somewhat cause a sense of dissonance for me. Why? Because, well, look, how can you reconcile in a single sentence or paragraph what Putin says? On the one hand, he claims once again that they have supposedly captured Kupiansk and surrounded 15 Ukrainian battalions. And this has supposedly been going on for a month and a half. These fake deceptions, new statements from the Kremlin, or their claim that they have captured Pokrovsk, which also does not correspond to the actual situation. Right now, there are heavy battles taking place there. Indeed, the enemy controls a certain part of the city, but what does that really mean? This goes hand in hand with Putin saying that Russia does not want a war against Europe, but if necessary, they are ready. So there's a kind of dissonance. Why are you waging such a prolonged fight for Pokrovsk and Kupiansk? Here you want to fight against all of Europe. Who's going to believe that? Well, maybe those who are, let's say, currently trying to pursue certain policies in Europe. They might not just believe it, but actually use it in their messaging. But that doesn't reflect reality. The same goes for further threats like cutting Ukraine off from the sea, advancing further, or creating some kind of security zone in the north. Well, it's all blackmail and intimidation. And it's an attempt to show the West, including the United States, that Putin supposedly has further strategic plans that he will implement if Ukraine does not make concessions. And we've been hearing about cutting Ukraine off from the Black Sea since April 2022. It was then that representatives of the Russian General Staff made a statement about the need to create a land corridor to the unrecognized Transnistria. Well, you just need to look at the map of military operations to understand that this does not correspond to reality and that Russia has not only failed to advance since then, but has actually been pushed back from places like Kherson, for example. But of course, the threat of missile and drone strikes still remains. Unfortunately, we can see that over the past month in November, the enemy has indeed been striking intensively. Strikes on the Odessa region. There are dangers. They are indeed present. That is why work is underway to find additional solutions. To strengthen our air defense systems, the enemy in turn is working on improving its own weapons, particularly Shaheds and other types of drones, so that they are less susceptible to the effects of our electronic warfare systems, making them harder to shoot down and counter. And unfortunately, in some areas they are having success, but we are also working on improving interceptor drones and other solutions that allow us to maintain our effectiveness, specifically in shooting down such enemy targets. And
if we go into more detail, if we move away from the negotiating table, from discussions and come down to the ground in the east, then I'd like to talk about Myrnohrad. Our military reports that this city is practically encircled. I won't use the word encirclement, but it is surrounded with supplies only getting through by drones, robotic platforms, and that many routes are blocked. Then at the same time, NATO officials, including those in the group focused on the Russian-Ukrainian war, report that 95% of Pokrovsk is controlled by the Russians. This was stated to journalists before the start of the NATO meeting yesterday evening, and they said that in Myrnohrad there is a narrow corridor through which Ukrainian forces can indeed withdraw certain units, but it is truly a very narrow corridor, and even it is under fire. Under control, depending on the situation, our troops are in there, especially if we're talking about encirclement, including in Pokrovsk. At the same time, the enemy is already constructing engineering fortifications. What do these engineering fortifications look like? So what should our soldiers do if Myrnohrad is encircled?
First of all, regarding encirclements, I would like to point out that during the full-scale war, we have faced certain threats, especially since the enemy has constantly used its propaganda resources to claim that an encirclement is imminent, that a large number of Ukrainian forces will soon be surrounded. Well, according to Putin's logic, there are still supposedly 15 battalions encircled in Kupiansk, which simply isn't true. Once again, just as we did not allow our soldiers to be left in a situation of complete encirclement before, we will not allow it now either. It is clear that if the challenges and threats increase, the command will make the appropriate decisions. As for Myrnohrad, the situation is stable but difficult. The enemy has used its aviation simply to destroy and level everything around to the ground. Drones, other types of weapons, and they are also trying to deploy assault groups. They are being held back on the outskirts of Pavlohrad, but indeed the enemy is increasingly trying to disrupt logistics. However, I can say that since October, appropriate decisions have been made. In particular, the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, General Syrskyi, is quite often working in this direction. Accordingly, the decisions that are being made, what are they aimed at? First of all, to ensure logistics by any means possible. That's essential. Secondly, to maintain the necessary corridors, so that this logistics can function and so that our soldiers are not cut off. And thirdly, to strengthen our drone component and not only deploy the reserves we can use in order to hold back the enemy. In other words, defensive actions are ongoing. This is a containment operation with the goal of inflicting maximum losses on the enemy and preventing them from gaining momentum in their offensive. Based on the results, for example, of November, we can say that this operation is succeeding according to the objectives that were set previously.
Thank you. On the outskirts of peaceful Hrad, you accidentally said Pavlohrad, just so our viewers don't get scared and misunderstand. Thank you.
Because now it will spread across the channels. Thank you very much. Oleksandr Musiienko, a serviceman of the Territorial Defense Forces of the Armed Forces of Ukraine and a military expert, was with us on the line. Next up is Sviatoslav Hrinchuk with a fresh TCH news release. We'll be back to you in 15 minutes.